Hello and welcome to the walkthrough for Unreal Engine 5.1. We're going to be working through all of the basic fundamentals which are relevant to the foundations of games programming unit, the Unreal part of it. So I'm going to take things step by step. Immediately missing the first step, which is just getting Unreal Engine to open, and that's because it depends on where you are as to what your approach is going to be. I'm recording this from home, so I'm using the Epic Games launcher. If you are working from home, the chances are you're doing the same thing. Otherwise, you will need to use Apps Anywhere. It should be straightforward enough to get yourself to this point, but if anyone has any trouble, of course, they can let me know. But once you've opened Unreal Engine 5.1, we should get into this particular area. It may open with recent projects, but either way, we're looking here for games, and we're going to start with a blank project. Project name, just a quick point of order, you can't have any spaces in there, so if you want to put any kind of way of different spacing out between the words, you're going to need an underscore. So if I just put, say, 5... practice. And then in terms of the project location, again, if you're working from home, this will be a little bit more straightforward. It will probably set to a default location, which is perfectly workable. If you're working in the university labs, there's a chance it will be trying to save it to a network drive that doesn't have permission to be saved to. If that's the case, you will need to browse to a folder and work backwards that way, see if you can find an appropriate place to put it. Chances are the best place to put it is going to be your student drive, or potentially if you have a Microsoft OneDrive account, that should work pretty well as well. I'm just saving it in the project. And then in terms of the basic starting project defaults, we want Blueprint instead of C++ for this one. We do want to target the desktop. We'll keep the quality preset to maximum. You may have starter content or ray tracing ticked. Make sure they're deselected. We don't really want any of them to begin with. And just click Create. Okay, so once it's finally loaded up, you should have something which looks like this. Very, very empty. Everything pretty much needs putting in from scratch in terms of the design and development. So the first thing I'll draw your attention to is down at the bottom here, which is your content browser window. So you'll notice here there's absolutely nothing in here at the moment. Just so we've got access to a few kind of basic assets, because as you remember, we didn't have starter content enabled. If we go into settings, and if we look through here, there should be somewhere about show engine content. I've got mine selected by default, which does give me the ability here to click on engine and look at content, which is in here. Gives me some static meshes, spheres, cubes, things like that. If you don't have settings and show engine content enabled, then you won't be able to see that. So do make sure, again, you press the settings button and that is clicked. And then we'll just go back to our main content. So this is the content folder, is where we're going to put all new content that we're going to be creating or importing into our project. So there are several things that I would like to do. The first is just get a basic object into the world. So I should be able to, you've got content browser here, but also go to place actors. And we have various different things that over time we're going to get used to knowing what they all are, but we just want some basic shapes in. So I'm just going to start with a cube and literally just drag that into the scene. Now you can see it is a absolute million miles away, and our starting location is actually our starting location is all the way down there, but where our camera is extremely high up. Now I've placed the cube into the world, if I right click on the cube and click on snap view to object, that should take us to that cube. See, we've gone all the way down to the bottom of the terrain where that cube was placed. But if we just change the position of this cube to 0, 0, 0, let's see where it ends up. 0, 0, 0. And now change snap view to object. Let's see where we end up. Okay, now we are in a much nicer central position. And we can do various things to manipulate these objects in space. Should all be pretty straightforward. And I'll draw attention to everything up to the top right. So if I just want to select between objects, I have my select. If I want to translate them, move them across these planes like so, X, Y, and Z axis, I can do that. I can Control Z and Control Y to go backwards and forwards, undo and redo. If I want to rotate, I have this one. And again, 3 axis motion I can rotate the object. Scale, I can either select in the center and do a uniform scale by holding the left mouse button and dragging up and down, or I can individually change the scale on any one of these, like so. Nice and straightforward. You'll notice these are all highlighted. You've got a 10 here. This is connected to the translation. So if I was to take that off and move to translation, I can now move it very, very smoothly. Really granular detail there. If I put that back on, but maybe change that a little bit higher, you can see how it will now kind of snap to the grid, which is on the floor, more or less. I think each one of these grid units is 100 units, so that's why that kind of works nice and neatly. But if I move it to 50, I should be able to put it right in the center. Yes, I can, just like that. So turning that on and off will change the grid snap value. Exactly the same thing for rotation. You can see here the rotation is fixed to 10 degrees, but I could change it to any of these. The scale is to 0.25 and so on. So they're the basic translation tools which you need to be aware of, and we just want to make this a usable player base. So in this instance, I'm going to scale, but rather than using the settings up here, I'm going to use the transform settings down here on the right hand. You can see if I click on any particular object, that will change the details panel down here. Again, there's other things going on in this scene, but I don't need to worry about those just yet. So we start with our cube, which is at its location. I'm going to put it back to 0, 0, right in the center, and then 50, keep that nice and neat. But then we can change the scale here. Now there's a little padlock here. That's to turn on and off uniform scaling. So if that is selected, it's locked. If I change 1 to 5, say, it changes it across all 3 axes. If I deselect that and would change that, I actually keep that as 5, but was to make one single one of the values changed, then it will just affect that value. And that's what we kind of want to do. We want a workable space. So if we do maybe say 20 by 20, now exactly how big that is we'll kind of find out as we start adding additional content into the world, but that should hopefully give us a decent starting point as a base for what we're going to be working with. So now we have that cube in the world. Okay, the next thing that I want to get straight on with is actually adding a player character into the world. Now that we've actually got something for them to be walking on, I think they can walk on this basic terrain here anyway, but for sake of argument, I wanted this cube in there just to show you the basic, some of the basic moves. But let's say we're going to start with here. We now need to start adding additional content into the content browser to be able to create our player character, something that we can attach simple movement to and just see it interacting, moving around the space. So if we right click anywhere in the content browser, you will have this come up, and there are various different bits and pieces which we need to put into place. Okay, the order isn't necessarily essential, and I may myself make a couple of mistakes, so you may need to bear with me, but we just kind of go through these step by step. If you follow along with this, it should work out pretty well. So the first thing that we need is just a basic blueprint class, and then within here we've got loads and loads of different options. Again, things that you're going to get used to embedding into your game as we go on. So if it feels overwhelming at the moment, don't worry about it. We're just focusing it one step at a time. Eventually you'll get to know most of these the more you work with the engine. But we are creating a player character, so we need a character. Now with a player character, we need to make sure that we're kind of following naming conventions, 1 to keep things tidy, and 2 to make things easy to find. So depending on what sort of asset we're working with, there's usually a prefix that we can use. In fact, there's always a prefix we can use. So any kind of blueprint, I would traditionally use BP underscore, and then whatever this is called. Now again, the more generic you make it, the more difficult it might be to find, particularly as your project gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So, you know, test or our player or player character might not be useful, because what if you want more than one player character and things like that. But whenever things are being kept pretty small in terms of scale, it's not necessarily too much of an issue, but something you might want to be thinking about. So we're just calling this BP our player for now. And if I then double click on the player character, and then you'll see this other window opens. If I click on it, it will do this, and I can drag it around and place it wherever kind of I like. There's various different places I could drop it, but what I want to do is just pop it here. What I don't want is separate windows that have to keep minimizing and maximizing. It's extremely irritating. So if you drag it into this particular bar at the top here, then being able to swap out between the view of your world and any of your blueprints, it's a nice, neat way of doing it. Now, you can see because we've got the actor specifically as a character, we have various different things that are already set up and ready for us to start tinkering with. So we've already got a capsule component for our collision. We've already got a separate arrow component, which just functions as a way of being able to tell which direction is forward. And we've got a space for us to add our character mesh. So we will start off with just giving it a mesh. You can see basically it's invisible at this point. And we've got an option to put in a skeletal mesh. So if I drop down here, you can see we've got various different options. Again, if you didn't have any assets in your project yet, or if you didn't have the engine content turned on, this could potentially be empty. So do make sure that you have engine content turned on. But we'll just go with a skeletal cube, very, very basic. So that's just identifying the mesh that we're going to use. And then underneath it, we've got the materials. If I click on that, again, because we've got engine content, there should be various things we can browse through and select whatever we like. We can keep something nice and simple, but I will stick with basic asset 2 just because it's a little bit shiny. I should then be able to, I think it's like kind of -80, but the idea is we want to make sure that the collision, which is currently this capsule, at the very least is its lowest point is at the same point as where the cube is, otherwise it will be a bit awkward when it's touching the ground. So if I, up here, if I change this 50 down to 10, I should be able to get it. I think it is, it's either -90 or -85. I can use my middle mouse, I can use my mouse wheel just to kind of double check that. I don't think that is perfectly right. If I click off that and make it really smooth, yeah, you can see it's not quite. So if we go to over here in the right side, -85, again, that's not absolutely perfect, but it should be pretty much spot on. I think for sake of argument, we'll do it as -90 and just see how that goes. But the idea is, of course, we want it towards the bottom of it. I mean, this isn't particularly ideal as it is already. So if I click on that and then look through the details here, there may be some things that we can change. You see we've got a half height and a radius. The radius isn't too bad. This kind of like the kind of the width of the whole thing, from this side to this side and this side to this side, but the half height is definitely too high. There's a couple of things we can do. We can type in manually, but you can also see if I hold my mouse to the sides of these boxes, I have the option of being able to kind of drag it left and right. I then need to, obviously the problem with that is that then means these items are now too high up, so I need to drag them back down. So again, same thing to make sure we're on. Okay, that doesn't actually let me move it, so this needs to now come back up here. So again, so it's nice, and that should be about right. Definitely too big. So let's make the cube a little bit bigger. I change the scale of that to 2. That looks a little bit nicer. There's also things you can do with the perspective, just to because obviously we're looking at it at whatever kind of angle we like. This is probably a good time to talk about how you can kind of use the mouse to look around the scene. I've kind of glossed over that. So the right mouse button, and by the way, it's exactly the same if you're looking around in the world view to if you're looking around in your kind of your object view within a blueprint. We can use the right mouse button, just hold down, and now the camera stays fixed in place, and we can rotate 360 degrees in any orientation. If I hold down the left mouse button, I can then basically kind of pan around. If I move my mouse upwards, I'm panning forwards. If I move my mouse backwards, I'm panning backwards. I'm not sidestepping left to right, so it's basically for forwards and backwards movement. There's still kind of rotation. If I left to right, I'm still rotating, but it's fixed along one axis, which is quite a nice motion to have if you don't know about it. And then the middle mouse, a little bit awkward to use, but if you press that down, now you can do that nice panning left and right. It stays fixed on the other plane of motion, but you can adjust your view in that particular way. It's a nice way. The other thing, if we now go to the top left here and we change the click on perspective, we've got top, bottom, left, right, and so on. This can just help us really neaten things out. It normally changes automatically to wireframe, but this enables us to see how well our cube is matching up with our sphere. So if I wanted to really make it nice and neat, that's again just a little bit too high. Maybe change that to -30. Again, not perfect. -25 is probably again probably isn't quite right either. But again, that probably will be okay. For sake of argument, we will plonk it right in the middle like so, and just see how it performs, and then we can come back to it. Change that back to perspective now, and you'll notice that was yellow a second ago. Any changes that you make in any of these blueprints will require you to compile. Over the years, as Unreal has developed, you're able to press play, and that often kind of pre-compiles before it actually starts you playing in the world, which again, I know we've not done yet, but we will get to that. But that compiled just as a good practice. If you do make any kind of changes, it's good to be regularly clicking on that, because it will throw up any errors if there's any issues in your code. So we've now got our character mesh in place. We should be able to effectively, and we won't for now, but we should be able to drag that into the world, and we can get a sense of how big that will be for relative to everything else. So it's quite small, but again, probably about right for the play area that we've created. So we'll delete that. Because we want to spawn him in as part of the game. So one of the things that we can do is, and we should be doing as a regular good practice, is saving. Now, if you go to File, you can save the current level, or you can, which is Control S, which is obviously what a lot of people are going to do, but that won't save any changes you've made to your assets. So as a good practice, save all is really what you should be doing. So Control, Shift, and S is usually the best way of doing things. You'll notice there it said kind of save level, because we haven't even created a map yet. So we need to do that. So if you right click, you'll see we have level, and this one is called New World, but again, we can just call it either level, or I like map, but underscore, let's just call it 1. Okay, so now we have map 1 loaded into place. And the other thing to make sure that we get right there is just when this is going to load up. So again, I'm going to be throwing you into a particular part of the engine where there is loads of other content, and yes, you'll need to get used to what that content is over time, but for the moment, just follow along. And we're going to go through it step by step. So in this instance, we just need to go to Edit and Project Settings, which will open a huge number of settings. Nothing we need to worry about too much, well, at all at the moment. We just go to Maps and Modes, and you can see Editor Startup Map and Game Default Map. Now, we're not going to be building a game anytime soon to run as an executable, so everything's going to be running in the editor anyway, but we do want to make sure that the custom level that we've just created is the one which opens up by default. Otherwise, you have to double click and open that every single time you open your project. So if I change that to map 1, you'll notice there's no save. There's not meant to be. Any change that you make here just automatically updates. So you have to be careful with the changes that you make. They are just saved automatically. So that is now set and in place. I can close that off and then go back to our map, and we're ready to go again. Control Shift and S just to make sure everything's saved, and go back to the player character. So there's a couple of things that I want to add. One thing is a camera, so that we actually have some control over the view and how the player character is represented. So as with most things, we're going to be attaching it to that capsule component. And you can see these are all the different elements that are making up our player character, and we want to add something to our capsule component. So as you can see here, we've got add. Click on that. Again, loads of different options, and what we are looking for is a spring arm for our camera. Click on spring arm, and we now have this. A little line will kind of extend out from the central point of our capsule component. If we then go to the spring arm, and now we're going to attach a camera to that spring arm. Now here in the top, I can type something just to shorthand rather than scrolling through absolutely everything. But if I just go for camera, and now we've got a camera attached to the end of that spring arm. So provided that camera is set as our main in-game camera, we are going to have basically a view which would look like, straight on, which obviously isn't ideal. That's not what we're looking for. So if we click on the spring arm, there are various things that we can change. If you go to the right details panel, you can see in camera, we've got target arm length. As you can imagine, if I scroll that backwards and forwards, that's going to increase the distance. We'll just set that to 400 for the time being to keep it nice and neat. If I change the offset for the socket, that is going to, that's going to bring it closer. And then if I change it across any of these, you can see it's changing the angle, but it's still keeping it facing in the same direction. So I just zoom out so you can see that a little bit better. You see that's going upwards, and then this is going left to right. So if I just change these, like I say, it doesn't update perfectly quickly. So if I just make the moves individually, it's probably a bit easier to see. So get it down so it is nice and straight on. Move it across like so, and then we're just going to go to that offset and just set it to 200 on the Z-axis and see what happens. And that puts it a little bit higher. If we change the target offset, again, a very similar effect, but slightly different in the way that it works, but we don't need to worry about too much of that. These are all things that you can be experimenting with. But what should happen there is that the camera obviously is straight on, so it's not looking at the player camera. Now, again, depending on the exact view that you're looking for, this may be something that you want to tweak with, but let's say for sake of argument, we want it so that it's definitely hovering above, but looking down to some extent to the player character. You can use the rotation either in the transform here. Again, we're clicking on the camera here, not on the spring arm. But if I rotate the camera just a little bit down, let's just do, again, it's probably 30 or 40 degrees is looking pretty closely at it, but we'll do a 20, so it's just kind of looking just over the top, just over the head, and compile that. And now we've got our player character's camera in place. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is make sure that the player is always going to spawn in the same place. So we need to make sure that they're in the world. If we were to press play now, let's just show you what would happen. Okay, we've got no player character because we've not got no player character assigned to our world, and it's almost exactly the same as being in the editor. I'm able to use my mouse just to kind of zoom God mode like around the world, and there's no character at all that drops into place. So now what we need is something to tell the game engine that our player character is our player character, and we want them to load whenever we start the game. So this time we're going to create another blueprint class, but this time we want a game mode base. So if we click on that, again, use usually the name of it, either GMB or GM, or again, for the most part, I would expect that it's, well, no, having said that, certain games will absolutely have multiple game modes. So again, it depends on the complexity of your project to whether you would need to make several of these and worry too much about a generic naming convention. But for sake of argument, we are just going to call it GM standard. And I suppose in that way, if we needed anything additional on top of that or to change between it for a certain feature within the game, we could do that. But once we've created it, we double click and open that. And it's all these details here. So again, it opens up as a standard blueprint, and it looks like there's an awful lot more that we need to think about than there actually is. All we really need to do is make sure that the player controller and the default pawn class is set to the unique our player. So we need to, we go to default pawn class, our player. Those shouldn't need to be changed at all. We don't have a player controller class custom yet at the moment, so it should be just that one, default pawn class, that we need to change. Again, compile. And then if we go into world settings, and we need a game mode override. So at the moment, it's not going to recognize that we're using any kind of custom game mode. So we want our game mode standard that we just created. And again, all of this should reflect what we changed when we double clicked and opened that GM standard. So again, we should see our player, yes we do, in default pawn class. So now Now that's all set and in place. Again, Control-Shift-S. You can see whenever you see little stars here, provided you're happy with everything, it may be a good time to save. Now if I press play, we are dropping our character into the world. So that has worked more or less as we wanted it to. The other thing you'll notice is it will start from wherever the camera is. So I press play now, drops me onto there. If I move into the center here, press play, drops me onto there. And that's not a problem, but there is one thing that we can do so that it's a little bit nicer. So no matter where our camera view is, it's consistently starting our game in the same point. Again, blueprint class, and if you just type in start, we've got player start. Click on that, select. Again, BP. Again, the chances are you may have more than one of these as you go. Again, depends on how many players you've got. Could be player 1 start, or player 1 start level 1. So again, naming conventions are going to become more important as you go on. P1. Let's just get into a good habit. BP start P1 L1, player 1 level 1. Drop that into the world, and you can see we've got this little icon here, which is going to tell the system where it wants to spawn the player from the beginning. Now in this instance, hopefully if I move far enough away this time and press play, still starts from the beginning. And then even though now I'm a bit closer, do it again, still starts from the beginning. So that's pretty much as we wanted it to be. So there we go, that is that sorted out. Okay, now the next thing that we need to do is actually get our character moving, and there are several things that we need to do here. The first thing is we need to, again, we're in our content browser, right click, input, and there are two things we're after. We're after an input mapping context, and we're after an input action. So if we start with our input actions, let's get those started first. And there's two things which I want us to be able to do for this cube. Again, shorthand or prefix introduction, IA, and we need a jump. And one thing I can do is click on anything that I want to duplicate. I believe it's either Control D or Control W, but Control D. Yeah, Control D, and that will make a duplicate. Right click, and let's change this one to IA move. So we've got a move and a jump. Now if I double click on that, and we've got yet another bunch of settings that we can work through. Action description, good practice, make sure that aligns. So it's called jump, so the action description is jump. That should stay the same. These should all be deselected, and the value type of digital boolean is definitely what we want. Basically, I mean, you can see for right click there's various different movements here, but for digital bool it's one of those, it's either on or it's off. So again, it's like more of a D-pad type button. You press the button, it happens, you release the button, it makes the effect, the move happen. You don't press that button and it doesn't happen. So that's nice and straightforward for jump. We can get rid of that game mode standard. And then IA move, this one a little bit more complicated, but if we just again call it move, again all of these should stay the same, but in value type we need to change this to axis 2D, and then save. And then we can close that one. Okay, so now we've got our two moves. We're starting to get a lot of different types of assets all collecting together in one folder in content. So we're going to start neatening things up a little bit. So we'll start with new folder, and we're going to move the input actions. So this one, I just want to call input. And we can click, if we hold down control, we can click on multiple things. So the jump, the move, and they can go into our input folder. And then we'll carry on working from within the input folder. So we've got our little moves there, but now we need to right click again, input mapping context. And again, we may have many of these, but for sake of argument, we're just going to call it IMP, and we're going to call this player 1. Okay, so now we need to set up our input mapping. So if we double click on this asset here, so this is our input mapping, and here is where we actually need to make those connections between the actual actions that we want the player to take and the buttons that we want the player to press. So if we create one mapping here, change this to, you can see in the drop down immediately we've got the two input actions that we created, jump and move. We start with jump because it's nice and straightforward. Create another one and then call that move because that needs a little bit more elements in to it. Now, once you've actually created that mapping, you can see this little drop down here with these other settings, triggers, modifiers, and so on. For jump, we don't need any triggers or modifiers, so we can select that just to leave it nice and neat. But we do need to assign a particular key. So if I type in space here, I've got the space bar. And then that's the mapping for jump taken care of. But now we need to go through the move. Now, obviously, we want to be able to move forwards, backwards, left, and right. And so there is, of course, a WASD binding that we need to do. So we need 4 of these. We've only got 1 at the moment. So we need 1, 2, 3, 4. And then this one we can attribute to the W. Just type in W. You can see it there on the keypad. Then we need S. Then we need A, which is here somewhere. There we go. And then we need D. Again, scroll down, and we've got D. Now, just to remind myself of all the different kind of triggers and modifiers for this particular system, I have totally cheated and created a little cheat sheet for the button map. So if I load up here, this will be available for you to download. And just noticing here, I've got a different order. I've got WASD, so it probably makes sense to do it in that same way. So if I go back up here, and change that one to A, and this one to S. That way it's following along with the other materials that you've got. But then when we drop down to here, we do need these activated because several of these do need some modifiers in place. So if we go to our little cheat sheet, we can see for W to move ourselves forward, there's no trigger modifiers or anything like that, but there are the modifiers here. So triggers, we don't need any elements, but modifiers do need something for some of them. So for W, we need a swizzle input axis value. So if I go back to the thing, we've got W, modifiers, add an element, just click here. Now we've got the new index. Where is it? Swizzle input axis values. And then that's that one taken care of. Go back to the sheets, have a quick look. A, we just need, again, another modifier, but it's called negate. So A, modifier, create a new one, negate, and then S, let's have a look. S requires both swizzle input axis values and negate. So we need 2 modifiers, 1, 2. We need swizzle input axis values and negate, and then D we can see doesn't need anything at all. That can be left by itself. And that should take care of all of those elements there. So now this is effectively creating this variation so that, if you press W, it's enacting exactly the same mechanism fundamentally as you pressing A, S, or D. It's all part of this move system, but we need to vary it so that obviously the actual output effect is different from going forwards, backwards, left, and right, which is why these particular values are in place for some in a different configuration each time. So press save, leave that all in place, and that is that taken care of. So that is all that we need to worry about with the input mapping and the input actions. So if we go back to our main content folder, and this time we need to open up our player character again. Okay, so now what we're going to do is actually connect all of this together. So the first thing we need to do is actually activate this input action mapping system which we've put together. So the very first thing we need is to get a reference to our player controller. So get player controller, and then again there's a lot of terminology to get used to. If we click here, just quickly go through our cheat sheet for what we're looking for, and here it is. Again, if you learn all and keep up to date with all of the jargon and technical terminology which floods Unreal, then you're a better person than I am. But it's enhanced input local player subsystem which we're after. So if we drag up from that and type in enhanced, there you go, you can see it appears there. And then if we type in input, let's just check it's the right one, check sheet again, add mapping context, that's what we're after. Add mapping context, there it is. Drag it into that, and then from here we've got our mapping context, which you can see the one that we created is activated there. Now that should nice and simply have everything activated. You notice my cheat sheet does have a cast 2 player controller. It depends on the way that you've configured the game mode and all of those things as to whether you need that. If I tried to cast to it, I got a little note saying I don't need to, I can just get directly from the controller. But if it doesn't work in this particular way, that may be the case that you need to drag up from get controller and go to a cast 2 player controller, but it wasn't necessary for me, so I will leave that as is. So that's activating the enhanced input local player subsystem. And now that means if we create an input action of jump, so if we just type in jump, you can see in input enhanced action events, we've got IA jump. And then we've got a triggered, started, all these various different things. And we just need triggered, and I believe it's completed or potentially cancelled. Again, you can mess around with these. They change what they're connected to every 5 minutes. So if I just scroll through, yes, it's completed that we want. Again, there's an action one where you can see everything which has been connected together, including some projectile firing, which we will do later. So minimize that. We need triggered to go to jump, and we need completed to go to stop jumping. And those two things are in place. Now, if we've done it right, always feels like a massive if, compile, go back to our world, press play, here's our character, and I press spacebar. And there we go. Okay, so something is working. Now I can tell there's a bit of a gap between the floor and the player. So just to neaten that up a little bit, because that's irritating me. If we go back to our player, go back to the viewport, and you can see we did briefly touch on this. There's obviously a gap here between the collision and the actual mesh itself. So I'm just gonna drag that down by 10. Again, I don't think that's perfect, but let's just quick play test, see if it's a bit nicer. Ooh, that's a lot nicer. So now we've got the jump in place, we need to work on the enhanced input move. So if we right click, IA move, make sure context sensitive is clicked. Sometimes I deselect that. And that's the one we need, input action move. So whenever it's triggered, we need a few things to happen. Again, going to my little cheat sheet so I can see exactly what's on there. We need get control rotation, get right vector, and then going into add movement input. So if we right click, get control rotation for the pawn, and then we need to split that structure, because we need, you can see if we go to the sheet, we've got all the individuals, which we need because we only need the X and the Z values to go into creating the right vector function. So get right, that's not spelled correctly. Because of the way that this is working, it's not happy with it at all. So if you have to deselect context sensitive in this case, and we just need the vector, because again, it's because when it spawns it in, it's just got the in rotation, it's not broken, so it doesn't take that singular value, which is why it's not working. So you need to do that separately. If you notice you drag out and it's not originally working, that's why. So your X and your Z go in there, and add movement input is what we're looking for. So if we go to here, add movement input, there we go, and we need 2 of these. So that one is for the left to right, and is going to go in there, and that should have that taken care of. And then we need control rotation again, but then we just need the Z going into a get forward. So if we do get forward vector, again math and vector, need to split it again, and it's just the Z, the rotation that we need. Again, that goes into the world direction, but then we need the scale value to have something in them. I'll just tidy this up a little bit. That to that. You notice all the other values being left at 0. That's absolutely fine. Connect that up. Nothing needs to go into the target. It's all self. But then the action value here, we've got a 2D structure. That's got our X and Y values in. If I right click and split structure there, it's got our X and Y. Now we need X to go into this one and Y to go into that one. Obviously, see it's getting a bit messy. If we double click anywhere in our lines, we can create these extra nodes that can tidy things up a little bit. Do the same thing for this. Just drag those out, make those nice and tidy. That can be brought up a little bit. And then that's everything that we should need there. Now, there are a couple of things that if you haven't got right, it won't create the particular effect that we're looking for. There's several things. So the first thing, they're all in the same place at least. So the first is in actually the BP self. You will probably need to search for this because browsing manually will be challenging. But if we type in yaw, there's use controller rotation yaw. Now, it will probably be set as true at the beginning. We want it set to false, so make sure you deselect that, otherwise the particular effect which we're going for won't quite work. Once you've got that in place, if you go to character movement, lots of these things I think you should be experimenting with once we've got the fundamentals in place, so you can start to learn slowly what they actually do. But if we scroll all the way down, we definitely want orient rotation to movement to be selected here. And then if we compile, if I've done everything correctly, select in, forwards moves us forward, down moves us down. You can see it's rotating around, left, right, up, down, and I've got the movement system in place. I should also be able to jump. I can rotate in the air, but I can't interrupt the nature of my jump, so I'm still jumping in the same direction until I land, but I can rotate while I'm in the air. And that's it. We now have our basic character movement in place. Okay, the next thing that I want to do is to create a projectile that the player can actually fire. So there's a few things that we need to do there. The first thing I'm going to do is create a new blueprint class. So actor, and call that BP underscore projectile. And if I double click that, open it up, and I just want to add basic mesh, so just type in mesh, just a static mesh is what I'm after. And then the properties, static mesh, and we just need just a nice basic sphere. Oh, it's very large, so if you just zoom out a little bit. So if I just change that to, well, I'll change it to 0.1, see what happens, maybe 0.2, see what kind of size we're looking at there. Again, give it a material. The arrow material looks alright, nice blue. And there we are. So that's our mesh, it's set to 0.2 in the scale. And then we're going to go back to our player. Now we've got a jump and our move, but we need an input action of fire. Now we haven't created that yet, so if we go out to our input maps, first we need new input action. Again, we probably just Control D to duplicate IA fire. Open that up. Again, we do want that to be a Boolean, so digital bool, action description fire. Again, consume input, everything else stays the same, no additional triggers or modifiers. Close that off and go back to our player and IA fire. No, IA fire, not IP fire. Enhance input action events. There it is, triggered. And when that happens, what we want to do is actually spawn in this projectile blueprint that we've created here. So there's a few things that we need to do. Again, just so I can recall the terminology, if you go to the move and jump image, you will see the code that we're using. So we're doing a spawn actor BP projectile. That's going to set its location from where it actually spawns right in front of the player, and then we're going to actually add an impulse in order to move it. So if I minimize that, so we'll do the spawn first, spawn actor from class, and we should have, if I type in projectile, BP projectile in the class dropdown, and then in the spawn transform, we can make the transform, although I don't think in the cheat sheet I needed to do that. If I just load that up, I just, no, it does have a make transform, but we're just getting the world location, everything else staying static, so the scale needs to stay as 1. Just drag that out a little bit so we've got a little bit more space. And we need a spawn point, ideally just in front of the player. So if I go to the viewport, we're at kind of obviously 0, 0. If I drag out a little bit, drag out to maybe 20, 30. So maybe if we add about, let's just say for sake of argument, 40 to the X value. So if we go back to our player, event graph, so in terms of the location, we'll just get the capsule component, get the location of that. Again, context sensitive can be back on. Get world location, capsule component. Okay, we're being like that, are we? There we are. Okay, then there's return value. And then we can add 10. In fact, what might be a nicer way to do it, and it's probably in the cheat sheet as well, just compile that, go back to the viewport, and we're just going to create yet another mesh just as a point of reference. So if I click add, again with capsule component selected, add another static mesh, drag, just sort of call that, let's just call that launcher. Drag that out to 40 in the front and compile. And it's launcher now. So again, we don't really need BP Projectile for the time being, so I'll close that off. But our player, event graph, and now we can use the get location of the launcher. And pop that straight into there. So that should now then spawn our BP Projectile, but it won't add any impulse to it. So if we then go to the return value and add impulse to the static mesh. Yeah, let's make things a little bit messy, but it should be okay. It goes now like that, and now we're connecting in. Now just in terms of the settings that we've got here, that's all correct and as we expected it to be. But then we need to get the forward vector from the capsule component and then multiply it by a certain value in order to actually make that impulse meaningful in size. But the idea is it's depending on whatever the rotation of the capsule component is, or the forward position based on the capsule component, then it will fire forwards effectively. So if I minimize that, and we'll get our capsule component in there, and it's the forward vector. And then if we just type in multiply, then that can go into the impulse, and it was, again, these particular, any individual values and settings that I give you, you can tweak and experiment with and see what effect they have. So that's the impulse of 0 and 0. Connect all those together like so. And that's everything in place. Now the physics is probably the one thing that we're missing, but we'll just see what happens for the time being. So we've got our camera out, moving around, press the left mouse button, currently nothing happens. That's probably because the input mapping hasn't been done. So IA jump, IA move, no it hasn't. So if I move the IA jump and IA move, then if I add another mapping, IA fire should be here. Here it is, we haven't attached it to anything, that would have been clever. Mouse, left mouse button, no triggers or modifiers. And let's play and have another go. Okay, it has an interesting effect. So this is definitely not exactly what we want. We've got a very, very strange effect which is going on here. Again, probably because we've got an issue with physics. Yep, simulate physics is not enabled. So if we now go back to content and to our projectile, bring that back in, go to the viewport, static mesh, and let's have a look through here. Physics, simulate physics is not enabled. So if we enable that and compile it now, let's see if it has an effect. Okay, it definitely works. One issue we have is that it is, as long as I press down the button, the more it is firing. So I'm ending up creating actually quite a cool, if I'm honest, projectile system there, but not exactly what we're after. There's a couple of things I think we can do there. The first is that the projectile is definitely too large, and that's partially what's pushing it back. It's spawning and then immediately colliding with the player, which we don't want. So if we make it a little bit smaller, let's see if we can get rid of that first problem. Yeah, now at least it's small enough that when it's spawning, it's not firing us backwards because they're not spawning at a point that they're immediately colliding. But we are having the issue of it. And if we're moving forwards, it's still pushing us back a little bit. So again, still not absolutely ideal, but I think the main problem here is that they're repeatedly having an effect. So we just need to make it so that they only trigger once. So go to the cheat sheet, you can see there is nothing on there which is making it happen once, it just says trigger. So if we minimize that, go into this element here, we've got left mouse button, and if we go into the actual input fire, digital bool, triggers and modifiers, so if we try trigger, and then it'd be one of these which will most likely have the right effect that we are after. So I believe it is pressed. Save that. Triggered. Compiled. And it was. There we go. So having that modifier as pressed is what was making it just spawn out just the once. But what I can notice there is obviously what that has done is, unless you've got a lot of momentum yourself, the projectile is not particularly exciting in the speed at which it's firing out. So maybe there's something we can do to make that even neater. Again, I think the projectile can be even smaller. We'll see what effect that has. Again, it fires it out a little bit better, but it's certainly not giving us a particularly powerful fire system. So we close that off, go back to our projectile, go back to our player, get that forward vector, and maybe see if we can bounce that up a little bit higher. So let's say 3000. Compile, play. And now we've got something which has got a wee bit more heft to it as we fire it around. Right, so the next thing that we need to have in place is actually something to shoot at. So we need to create an enemy character. So if we create a new blueprint class, and this is going to be a character, and we're going to call that BP enemy. Now, the reason we're using a character rather than just a basic actor or a pawn or anything like that is there's a lot of functionality in here which we're going to need when we start adding AI into the system, or basic AI into the system. So do make sure you use that character class, a blueprint, more than anything else. So double click to open up enemy. Again, it's exactly the same as the our player to begin with. We've got the capsule component, a mesh to start with, and so on. So in this instance, we would like the mesh in place first of all. We've only got the cubes to play with. I kind of want a sphere. Doesn't really matter, but we shouldn't be able to delete this because it's embedded in within C++, so we can't change that. But what we can do is add to the capsule component static mesh. That will give us the sphere. So click on that. Now we should have our edit sphere that we can use. Again, far too big. Change that to 0.5, 0.3 maybe even 0.2. That's it. And then drag that down so it's at the bottom of the capsule. Again, that might be a little bit too high. In fact, I'm almost certain it is. That's about right. Change, although now we're going to change the capsule half height to 0. Then we need to drag that back up into the exact right place. Okay, so that looks pretty neat and tidy, matching up the collision with the mesh. Change the material to something nice. Red for enemies, why not? Okay, and now we've got the basic bits and pieces in place. So we now need to go to our event graph. Delete all of this for now. Nice blank canvas to work with. Again, I am going back to my cheat sheet. So this is the main thing that I want to happen. We have the player shoot a projectile, it hits the enemy, and then something happens. In this instance, it checks how many health points, which we're going to assign to this enemy, the enemy has, takes one of those points away, if that value reaches 0, then it will destroy the actor. The update enemy number we will come back to, and we'll also move to the giving the enemy a health bar a little bit later as well. So at the moment we just want it so that if we hit the actor with a projectile, it will destroy the actor if we hit them a certain number of times. So if I minimize that, so we're starting with an event overlap. So if I just type in event actor begin overlap, okay, it's the component, so we need the capsule component. So if we click on capsule component, add event, and actually if I just do overlap with that selected, that should work. Add component begin overlap, pretty sure that is right. No, this is the actor, what am I talking about? So we need the begin overlap function. So event actor begin overlap. And then what we don't want is every single time the enemy collides with just anything that it loses a health point. That's not particularly helpful. So we need a way of being able to tell the system to differentiate between the projectile hitting it and just anything hitting it. So we'll go for other actor, and we can do get object name. And then from this string value, we can type equals, or actually a better way is probably contains, just to make sure, because there could be additional things added into the object name, extra numbers and so on, but the substring is more likely to always give us the right result that we want. So within the substring, that's basically what it's looking for in the string of the object name. We just need something which is only going to appear in the projectile object name, which is projectile. So it checks for that, and you can drag from the Boolean value and type branch, and then connect those up. And then of course the idea here is that it will not trigger anything unless the object which is overlapped with the actor is definitely a projectile. So you can see there contains object name, and then it takes it from there. So what we've got here is a destroy actor immediately connected in, and the idea is that we want the projectile itself to disappear the minute it hits the enemy. So we can drag out from other actor and type destroy actor. So that will get rid of our projectile immediately on contact with the enemy. Again, a couple of extra bits just to tidy up, a little bit of crossover, so that's definitely not perfect, but not too bad. And then once it's done that, we then need to do something depending on player health. So, I mean, the first thing we can do just to see if it works at all is just do another destroy actor to not only destroy the projectile, but destroy the enemy as well. So now when the enemy is hit, then they will just disappear. So first of all, we need to actually get them into the scene. So we'll scroll out a little bit, literally just drag and drop them in. There he is in place. So that's our enemy, static and not doing anything. Hopefully if I line it up properly, hit it, and that doesn't work. The reason for that is that we don't have the right collision in place. So it's checking for an overlap rather than a hit. So those two things can't just come into close contact. They have to literally overlap each other. And with the projectile, there is nothing attached to the static mesh. So it's just kind of bouncing off the surface of the enemy without anything kind of overlapping at all. So what we need to do is attach a sphere collider to our static mesh that will follow the static mesh. But that will allow that overlap to actually work. So if we create a new component, it's sphere collision that we're after, attach that, you can see it's very small, it needs to be larger than the mesh. So if we try maybe, let's say a scale of 8, yeah, so just a little bit larger, compile that, and then let's try that again. So again, we get ourselves into position, fire, and then there we go. Now it's disappearing. So if you find you're having that issue, that's what that is about. So we have the basics in place now of if you hit the actor with, and we can check that with something else. So for example, if we press play and just go into the enemy, you know, nothing is happening there. It only has an effect if we actually fire a projectile. So that's fine, but what we don't want to do, although we do want to destroy the projectile straight away, we don't necessarily want to destroy the actor every time. So this is the bit where we can do a little bit of nice gameplay programming. So variables, we need to create a new one, press plus here, and then new variable, and we want enemy health, ENE, and case health. And in the Boolean, we can sorry, in the kind of type of variable list, it always starts as a boolean most of the time. So if we change that to an integer value, so we just need a whole number here, press compile. If you don't press compile, you won't be able to change the default values. Do make sure you press compile, and then in your details panel, which should be over here, we're going to set the enemy health to 4. Now what that means, because obviously you have to think about integers, they always start at 0. So with an enemy health of 4, that basically means the enemy health has 5 hit points, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then 0. And it's not until it gets to 0 that we're actually going to destroy the actor. So enemy health starts off at 4. Drag that into the world. You've got a choice of either setting it or getting it procedurally. So we'll just go for getting it at the moment. And the idea is we want to first of all check if it is 0. If it's 0. So if it's equal to 0. Actually, that's not the first thing we want to do. It's the second thing we want to do. The first thing we want to do is decrement it by 1. So if you type minus twice or decrement, you'll get decrement integer, and you'll get this lovely node here. So drag from destroy actor through to the decrement. So whatever the current enemy health value is, will go down by 1. It will then go into here. Then after it's gone down by 1, we can check it. Its new value, so not there. Make sure that one doesn't go in. We can check that after it's been had 1 taken away. If it is now 0, if it is, destroy the actor. If it's not, something else. What we can do before we do any UMG stuff, just to see it working, we can just it won't let us do that, but if we type print string and then just connect those two, it'll give us a little converter, but that's fine. If we false, do there. So the idea is we should be able to see each time we hit it, it going down by 1 before it gets to 0, and then it will destroy it. So it was at 4, I hit it, it's now 3, hit it, it's now 2, hit it, it's now 1, hit it, and it disappears. So we've now got our health points in place. So what I'd like to do now is set up the widget so that we actually have a health bar floating above the enemy character, which goes down or it's depleted each time that the enemy is hit. So there's a number of things that we need to do here. And again, things are starting to get a little bit messy, so I think it's time for a little bit of folders and tidying. So I'm just going to create a new folder and call it widgets, or you can call it UI or UMG. I think we can call it UI. And we're going to put our widgets into here. So the first thing is we need to right click in that folder, user interface, and widget blueprint is what we're after. Just a common user widget. And then again, I would call them underscore either UI or UMG, either's fine. Since we use a folder as UI, we'll use the prefix as UI as well. And enemy health as a title. And then let's double click that and open it up. Now it's very similar to the blueprint system that I've been working with so far. The major difference is we have a designer view, see in the top right, and a graph view. The graph view is exactly the same or very similar to what we're normally used to working with, but the designer is a little bit different. And this is where on the left side we have our palette, and we've got all these different elements that we can put into place. So again, just following along, the first thing I want you to do is to open the panel and create a canvas panel, drag it onto UI enemy health, and that will give us a panel to work with. The screen size is set to fill the screen from the beginning, but what we would like to do is set it to custom and have it be the exact size of the health bar that we want to use. So for sake of argument now, if I change that to 300 and the height to 50, that's an okay looking bar size, 350 there, and then we need a progress bar that we drop into the canvas panel. So that will set at 0, 0, but we want it the same size as that. So again, we've got all the details for our progress bar. So make sure those match up. 300 for the height, 50 for the 300 for the width, 50 for the height. You'll see it is grey, and then there is a progress which is set to %, although that basically moves between a value of 1 and 0. So 1 is full and 0 is completely empty. You can see the fill color and opacity we can change here as well. If it's the enemy, I don't think it really matters what we decide to use. I'm just going to change that to a nice green. So it's green to begin with, and as it descends, the color will change. There should be a fill color, so a different change, so we can change the actual the color as it as it goes down. If I keep scrolling through, see if I can find it hiding around in here somewhere. Fill color and opacity, nope. Left, right, mask, scale, border padding, style. Background image is what we're after. So if we tint that to a nice red, a little bit softer so it kind of matches the hue of the green. If we now do a 0.5, we should get green and red. Yep, that's about right. So change that to 1, which is what is our standard. And that's pretty much it for the design. Now if we go into the graph, it's very simple what we want to do. Some of this will become clearer as we move a little bit further, but for now, if we just follow along. So we want to right click and we're creating a custom event. You could just type in custom event or what have you. But we want to call this update health. Or again, if we're going to be nice and precise, enemy health UI. And what we want to do, so we're going to trigger this at some point, but don't worry about that for now. But what we do want to do is attach an actual input variable to this. So if you click, and once you've got that selected, you'll have all of this available here in the details panel. Click on add an input, and we need a new parameter, and that we are just going to call the health value. You'll see how these are all connecting up pretty soon. We'll have this set as a float, which is what it ultimately needs to be. And then we can update the progress bar. So we get the progress bar, drag that in here, and we need to set the percent value. So that will go. I sometimes quite like to drag the target just above. That usually looks quite neat. Some people do below. Either is fine. But then because we've got our health and our percent, we literally just connect those up, and that is it. So when this is triggered, it will take a health value from an input somewhere. Once we connect everything up, it will update that percent and then set that progress bar. So hopefully that will then the progress bar will change from green to red each time the player hits in equal amounts. So that it should be enough for UI enemy health. And we can go back to our BP enemy and now have this element work here. So the very first thing we need to do before we do anything else is actually get the widget into the scene. So if we go to the capsule component, we'll add it to that. So add, and if you type in widget, we just need widget, and that appears there. Again, we'll call this something specific in case you wanted multiple ones. So then in the details panel, we've got loads of different things we can work with here. We should duplicate the draw size to be the same as what we had in the original widget, which was 300 by 50, I believe. Then in the widget class, UI enemy health, the one that we created, is there. And then we can see that has appeared as we need it to be. Definitely a wee bit big for our purposes, so the scale size should have been a little bit smaller in the original UI enemy health, but to make things simple on ourselves, we can just make it smaller here. Maybe make it 0.3 and just hover that nice and neatly above the player character. You should also find that when it updates. Yep, so it's a forward position. Obviously the character here is facing the wrong way, so if we go to our details panel, just have him facing the player from the beginning. You'll notice that it only renders on the one side. We're going to do something to fix the rotation of that in real time a little bit later, but for now we just want it so that we can clearly see it in the scene. So if I press play, it should still be there. So it's attached nicely, but of course if I hit it, there's no updating just yet. So let's get that working. So now we've got it in the scene, we can go to our event graph, get our health. We can get the widget, which is attached to our kind of widget holder, if you will, and then we can cast to whatever we called it, cast to UI enemy health. Again, just refer to my cheat sheet to make sure I'm doing this correctly. Yeah, widget, get widget, cast to UMG, and we call it enemy health. Probably better to do it that way. But then because we've done this cast to, we should be able to access this custom event that we created because we're casting to it. So with that cast in place, what did we even call it? Did I just call it health? Update enemy health UI. That's nice and in place, and then we need to make sure, as you can see, because in the enemy health we had that health parameter which connects into percent. We need to plug something into that. And so what we can do is take the enemy health value and then translate that so that it's relative to that 1 to 0. So because we've given our enemy 4 health points, we can convert that to a float value first of all, otherwise it won't give us the decimal point that we need. Then if we hit divide, and we can divide that value by 4 and then plug that into the health. So that should work like that. Now this is the bit where I expect it not to work at all, but we press play and see what happens. Let's move ourselves into place. Oh, so it didn't register a hit that first time, so there's definitely something in the collision. Probably that collision sphere needs to be a little bit bigger. But when it was hit, it goes down by 5, and when it gets to 0, it disappears. So just try that again, maybe with the projectile. Go back to content, go to our projectile. Again, it is relatively large, so it's being a little bit picky, but maybe if we change that to 9, a little bit bigger. Let's see if that makes things any more reliable. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the enemy is hit. Okay, so now that we have all of that widget interaction in place, the next thing that we need to do is have it so that as the player moves around the character, the widget actually kind of rotates to keep up with that. You can see if we keep moving around like this, it's always facing in that one singular direction. If the enemy, once we start adding movement to them, was to start rotating, then it would move with them, and if we ended up at the wrong angle, then we wouldn't be able to actually see it. So what we would like to do is, as we're kind of moving around the angle, have that widget rotate to always face the camera. Okay, so to get the rotation working, first we need to get an event tick. And then every frame we need to update the rotation of the health widget. So we take that and set rotation. Set world rotation is what we're after. That will go into there. But then we need to determine what the appropriate rotation is based on the position of the camera. So again, if we just zoom in here a little bit, we need the player camera manager, we need a transform component, and then the world location. So type in camera manager, get player camera manager, then transform component. Then we've got get world location and then find lookout rotation. Get world location, find lookout rotation. And you're making sure that is connected into the target, not the start. So you can see they're not connected in the right way there. So it's the target is the player camera manager, and if we look here, it's the widget which is the starting point. So we also need the widget's world location. So if we drag that, or health in this case, that health into the scene, we should be able to do a bit of copy and pasting. Get world location, Control D, Control V, return value, start, and then that will go into there. So a quick test just to see how that's performing at the moment. So you can see it's now at a bit of an angle, and there we are. If I move from left to right, it will rotate based on the player camera. You notice it's not affecting the position of the player. So if I move behind, it doesn't rotate to follow that around, it follows the rotation of the camera. The idea being that from whatever angle, we've got a pretty good view of the enemy as we're shooting it. Okay, so now we need to take a look at the HUD. So if we go to our UI to begin with, and I want to create a new widget. So user interface, widget blueprint, user widget again, and same as the previous widget, UI, we'll just call that HUD. Double click to open that. So once that's open, we can this time keep the screen size and fill screen as it is, but the same as last time, we go to panel, grab a canvas panel and pop that there. Right click to just center that, move that around a little bit. So the main element which we want to have in place is a player health. So the first thing that we can do is we can get a horizontal box. That's probably a nice way to arrange it. There's loads of different things for you to explore and experiment with. What this will do is just neatly stack things from left to right. We can place multiple objects within this horizontal box. And in this case, we're just going to keep it nice and simple and just put 2 pieces of text in there. So drag text into the horizontal box and drag another one, do the same. And you can see it auto-populates them left to right. So what we can do now is, again, you'll notice everything's given a generic name to begin with, and we want to make sure that we keep things as specific as possible. So we're going to call this health. In fact, we'll just call it health prefix to show it's going before the value. And we're going to change the text in there to health. In fact, just to make it a little bit neater, we just put that in there, just a little colon. And then here, this is the actual text that we're going to use for the variable itself. So we'll call this health var. Just a way of differentiating the two from each other. Now this one we'll set at set it as 100 to begin with. And then we can move this just into the top left of the screen. I think we're nice in the health if we just pop an extra space there, so a little bit of a space between the two. We don't need this much space here, so we can drag this up, make it a little bit smaller. The idea is this would stick in place no matter what. So you can change this to, let's say, 50, and the transition should be relatively neat and tidy as the player health goes down. So if we change that back to 100 now, so we've got health on this side, and press compile. And what we need to do now is have, very similar to the update from the enemy health, is just create a custom event in the graph editor. So right click, add event, custom event, and call it player hit. And similar as last time, if we click here for an input, change that to, this can be an integer value this time, and we can change that to player health. There we go. And then we can drag out this health variable. Now if I didn't explain it, just to make sure I made that clear, you can see in the hierarchy at the bottom left, all the different individual elements here by default are not set to variables, so we have to state if we want something to be a variable, and by variable that'll mean it will then appear as something we can edit in the graph window. So here only health var needs to be a variable. There's no point making things we don't want to control variables, just leave them as elements to place on the canvas. But health var is something that we need, so that's a text object. So if I drag out here and type set text, then I can update that text based on whatever the player health value is. You know, this is a text value, but that shouldn't matter. We should be able to drag from player health. It'll create a conversion for us. There's a few options here if we want to say set something so there's always a fixed number of integral digits. So if you want it where it's 3 digits to begin with at 100, but then if it goes down to say 75, it'll say 075 if we change the minimum number of integral digits to 3. But we'll just leave that as 1, so there'll be no significant change at all. It will just convert directly whatever the integer value is without adding any zeros on the beginning or anything like that. But now every time this event is triggered, it should update the health status. So that's it for the HUD. We should be able to leave that. If we go back to our content folder, and now if I just to remind us of what we want, so what we want to happen is we want to be able to move around, but then when we hit the enemy, that collision causes a loss in health. So the first thing before we do anything else, actually make it so we can see the HUD visible. And we can do that by opening up our player. So our BP player, and we'll have that as one of the very first things that happens. So if we create an event begin play, we already have that, so it's add mapping context. What we can do to just neaten things up a little bit is just cut that out, move that over here, and create another event for this add mapping context, and literally just give it a nice specific name. There's something which is going to happen on start, and then we'll have event begin play as a series of things that happen on start. So we just keep things a little bit neater. So if we put add mapping, we can call out that function below. So exactly the same thing will happen. Event begin play goes to add mapping context. We've just put a little intermediate here, but it also means we can keep it nice and neat and add additional custom events that we also want to trigger at the same time as the event begin play, because one thing that we do want is to add the HUD. So we can custom event, add, let's just call it add UI this time. It could be add HUD or whatever you want it to be, but we want this to also happen on event begin play. So I've typed add UI, that's there. So again, these are all kind of begin play things. And a little thing that you can do, I suppose I should mention it now because we've gone a long time before we actually get into it, but if you drag over any bit of code, any of the blueprints, and press C, you'll also generate a comment. You can then call that whatever you want. So we'll call this on play. There's a few things else that we can do. We can change the comment color. For this on play, I like to kind of draw attention to exactly to where on play is. So I'll make that green, make it just a little bar, and have that in a clearly visible place, so we know all the things that are going to happen right at the beginning, and so I can easily navigate to some of those specific events. But obviously you don't have to do that. You can just press Ctrl C, call it whatever you want. So again, this is the add mapping. And you can change the color. There's a show bubble when zoomed. That's quite useful when these start to get a bit unruly, although normally we should be thinking about architecture a bit more cleverly by that point. But I actually prefer to have that disabled, have a little bit of space around the comment, and change the font size to something a little bit bigger. So if we change that to 30, then that's something which even when you're quite zoomed out, you can still quite clearly see it. Whereas when you have the bubble that's zoomed, because it kind of gets larger and smaller with the way that you zoom, actually sometimes I find that a little bit awkward and it overlaps things and doesn't actually make things any clearer. So that's the comments. But let's get back to the UI. So we've got everything linked up as it should be. So now we can actually start creating our little add UI function. And what we want to do is create a widget. So if we type create widget, we get this construct, and then class, we need the UI HUD. And then drag out from there, and we're going to add to the viewport. Okay, and then hit compile. And so now if we press play, we should see that player health, as you can, just at the top left, is now presented when the game begins, which is exactly what would happen. So there we go, very good. So the next thing that we want to do is get the on player hit element in place. So we've got that add UI. Just going to start tidying things up a little bit. Add UI. And maybe drag that over here with the other comments that I've made. But then we need an on player hit. So if I go to my cheat sheet, this is effectively what we're looking for. We want on event hit, that's the player. It's going to get the object name, because obviously we don't want the player to just collide with absolutely anything and then that makes something happen. We want it to hit the enemy character, and only the enemy character will trigger this process. Then it will affect the player health. It will update the player health on the HUD. I've also got an optional little element which is a play world camera shake, and another optional element where it actually makes the player jump backwards a little bit, or jump a little bit in the air automatically, before then creating a quick delay through a do once gate. Now the reason this is here, as we'll get to in a little while, is to make it so that you don't just hit the player and then just immediately just keep losing health every frame, because usually if you collide against them, you collide against them for a couple of seconds. By that point you would have lost all of your health in one go. So we use the delay in order to make sure it can't just keep doing that. I'll show you what I mean in a moment. So what we need first of all is an event hit. So if I type in event hit, we can see through the collision menu we've got event hit, and these are all the other options that we've got. So what we want to happen is first of all get the other, and again same to the last time, we want to get the object name, and we'll do a contains. There are several different ways in which you can go about doing this, but this is just one particular method that I can use. So substring, again in this case it needs to be the enemy. Okay, let's do a quick double check that I did actually call it. Yeah, BP enemy, so as long as it has enemy in place. You'll notice use case isn't ticked. In this case, if I did have that ticked, it wouldn't work because I've spelled enemy with a lowercase e at the beginning, and it's uppercase in the way that it's presented there. But here, that shouldn't make a difference. Then, in order to enact that, differentiate between the two, we can put a branch in place, and now we need to actually have an effect on player health. Now we don't actually have a player health variable yet, so at the bottom left we can create one. So new variable player health. We need an integer value. We'll do the default as same as it was set in the HUD, which was 100, and we can drag that into the scene here. And then if we just press minus, we want to subtract, and then we can determine exactly how much we want to take away from the player health whenever they are hit. So if we then drag out player health again and click set, connect these up like so. So we get the current player health, we take away a certain value and then reset that value. So in this instance, we can set it to, let's say, 20. So the player effectively can survive 5 hit points, and then that's it, or 4 hit points, and then on the 5th, that would go to 0. So minus 20. And then what we need to do is to access the player HUD and enact that. So if I just go quickly to my cheat sheet, remember we've got that do once to make sure that we put in place as well, but we also need to get the player HUD and run that update. Now you'll notice there's no cast to or anything else going on there. One thing that we can do to make this a little bit quicker, if we go back to our add UI, we can neaten things up a little bit by not only adding it to the viewport, but actually creating a reference to the HUD that actually will exist in our player character. Neaten things up a little bit. Now if I drag out from return value, there's literally an option here called promote to variable, and if we do that, connect those up a little bit like that to that. Don't need all of those connections. Break link to add to viewport, and we can do that. Customize the name of the UI. I'll just use exactly the same term which is used for the widget itself as a reference. And now we can go back to our little bit of code for event hit and drag out that reference. And we should be able to get this player hit event. So if we drag it from here, player hit, call that function. That will go to there, and our new updated player health can be input into that. So now every single time we are hit, we will check if it's an enemy. If it is an enemy, it will take 20 off our health, and then it will update the HUD appropriately. Now let's just see what happens when it's at this stage. So it's at 100 at the moment. Go up to it. Yeah, just immediately the minute I touch it, it goes down, and you can see like every frame it's taking 20 off. So we're getting into pretty low health pretty quickly. So if we now just go through that do once process, so just between true and set, we can type in do once. That will go to there, and then just put a little delay in place. Now I set that on my cheat sheet to 1 second. We'll keep that the same, and then complete it, and then create a little loop. It's a bit messy, but if we create some extra nodes, one there and one there, and let's try that again. Now there should be this little gap between the two. So we should go up there, and it will still, if I stay close, it should still tick away if I go close to it again, 60, 40. But again, it's once every 20 seconds, which in something which is a little bit more fast moving, it's not likely to be anywhere near as problematic. Now, of course, you could mess around with this value to see if you can find something more appropriate. Say we've set it to 1. And I think just very quickly, before we put the camera shake in a little bit later, we can put the jump in now just to show what that will do. So there's nothing complicated we need to do that. Again, it's just between the player and the delay. We just need to enact jump. And there's a function connected to our character that's already there. In exactly the same way, it's basically this exact same function. It's just being triggered to when you hit something. And then if I press play, we should have a quick look, which means I'll kind of auto bounce against something, which just gives that nice little bit of feedback, throws the player up in the air a little bit, separates them, puts a bit of distance between the player and the enemy whenever there's a hit. Again, stops that kind of endless cycle of the health going down and down and down and down. Okay, the next thing that we want to have a look at is creating another user interface, this time one for a shop where we can actually use our mouse cursor to select between different objects and then have those different objects or items have an effect in the game. So the first thing to start with is back to our UI again. So we need yet another UI. So again, user interface down at the bottom, widget blueprint, user widget, UI, and this one just going to call shop, and open that one up again. Now again, this wants to be the full size of the screen. So if we go to the panel, canvas panel, and then we're going to put everything in the center here. So again, how you neaten this up is completely up to you. There's a number of different ways that we can go about doing this. But I think as a good starting point, we need to have, and again, trying to do this off the top of your head is a fascinating thing. Yes. So what we need to have is a vertical box to begin with. So place that into the world, make that a little bit larger. And there's a number of different items which we want to place into here. So the first one is just a piece of text. And that's going to create our basically kind of title. Doesn't need to be a variable, so we are just going to call this shop. Actually, we can call it shop title. That's not correct. Title. And the text we can just change to shop. As you can see, these are pretty straightforward options you've got here, being able to change the justification, depending on how you do the alignment as to whether the justification will work. But exactly how you want to use these buttons, there's a number of different things you can change, the font, color opacity, and so on. We just change the font to something a little bit different just to show you. Just change that to regular. You can import your own fonts if you need to. You can change the size, make that a little bit bigger. So that's just our title, and then all of our different items are going to be placed here. So after we've got the shop in place, we now want the different items that are actually going to be selected and dropped into here. Now, the trick here is that we're actually going to do widgets within widgets. So we need to now leave this alone and create one more widget, this time user interface, blueprint widget, user widget again, and this is going to be UI item. That needs to be a plus. No, it needs to not be a plus. And then open this one. So now we can actually have the user interface item as something which can be populated within our user interface shop. So it can get a little bit complicated, but if we just go through it step by step, it should make some sense. So we start with the UI item. So this instance, we don't need the full screen size. We just need something quite small. So if we go for a width of, let's say, about 500 and a height of about 50, and if we put a canvas panel in there as well, at 50, yep, at 550, and then we want the entire widget itself to effectively be a button. So each item is a button that the player can click on, and it will be populated with some information about it. That'll all be generated from a table, because the main thing that we're trying to get at here is that the shop inventory is a really good way of demonstrating our understanding of structures and of data tables. So now we have our button in place. We need to make it the same size as the canvas, so we can change the size to 500 to match up, and this to 50. And then within this, we want to populate various bits of information. So we need to, inside here, place a horizontal box, which is actually going to go inside the button like this. And then inside here, we're going to put several bits of text. 1, 2, and 3. And this one is going to be, the one on the far left is going to be the name of the object. So just call it item name. And this is going to need to be a variable, so we'll have that set as such. Make sure that's ticked. In fact, make sure all 3 of these are ticked. Center one is going to be description. And the right one is going to be the price. And for the time being, we just need to make it so that these kind of fit relatively neatly within the button itself. So if we change this, if I can change all 3 of these to a slightly smaller value of maybe 16, and then change the description in the middle to definitely an even smaller value, because there's probably going to be more text in that. So the first thing that we need to do to neaten this text up is actually go to the horizontal box and spread the horizontal alignment to fill horizontally. I'll spread them all out like so. And then if we go to each individual one, we should be able to space them out quite nicely. Align that to the left, align that to the right, align that to the middle, align that to the left. I think they need to be set to fill, otherwise it won't quite work. So all 3 set to fill. To text block 1 on the left, that one on the center justified, and that one on the right. So horizontal alignment done in that particular way. All of them set to fill, and remember to have the horizontal box set to fill horizontally. And last thing, that middle box, just so it's a bit neater, we can change that vertical alignment to the center so that it looks as relatively neat as it can. We don't need any of these to actually have text values in, so once we've got that kind of looking neat, we can just put a placeholder so we know there is some text in place and just have that set up like so. Okay, and that should cover the beginning anyway of the user interface item widget. So we just do Control Shift and S. We should now be able to go back to our user interface shop and actually add in the vertical box a custom user created widget. So if I scroll down, there is UI item, which we created. There it is, and we can pop that in here. We can do that multiple times. So let's just say we want 3 items in this shop. We place them in there like so. It may be possible clicking on each one individually to, definitely don't want to fill it out. It's not quite as big as the shop itself, so this shouldn't change anything. So if these were, however large we go to UI item, it was 500. So if I change the width of this canvas, I say 624 to 500 to match up. It didn't like that, did it? That's probably because it was a position X I was changing it to. If I change the size X this time to 500, yeah, well, that's a little bit neater. And we can bring that up just a little bit neater like so. So if I just compile that and save it. Now we just need to know what this looks like on the screen. So if we just go back to BP Our Player, and where we added one UI, it makes no reason why we don't add another one. So we basically just Control V, Control C and V, like so. This time it's going to be UI shop, add to the viewport, and just to see it working, we're not actually going to use this as the main way we're going to be generating it, but just for now we'll just have it so we can see if it turns up on the shop. Yes, it does. And once it's there, we can click on it, or at least we could straight away. But what it doesn't allow us to do is to activate the cursor. You'll see the cursor is available straight away at the beginning of the game, but the minute I click anywhere in the game world, it disappears. But the buttons are working, so now there should be a way that we can get some functionality off that, and it is relatively well centered. A couple of things to go over there actually. If we go into the UI shop, in terms of the way that it's positioned, if you go to the canvas panel at the top, and if we actually change this canvas panel to be, oh, it's the full size of the screen anyway, that's okay. But the vertical box, if we change this to be anchored in the center, and that's the center, we can see there's the full size of the canvas panel. And if we drag this to more or less be in the middle, we just press left and right to make it a little bit neater and tidier. It's more or less centered. It probably needs to be minus 250 for it to be perfect. Minus 250, that's pretty much spot on. If you compile that and play, it should be anchored, yeah, more or less perfectly in the middle of the screen. And if I drag the screen a little bit larger or smaller, you can see it changes the size by default when we change the screen size vertically, but it keeps everything relatively well anchored to the center for the shop and to the top left for the health because of this use of the anchor points. That's definitely something worth knowing. So the next thing we need to do is actually have something within the game that opens and closes the shop. So we just use this for testing, so we don't need it. We can delete that and compile. And if we go back to the main area here, if we go back to content, and we need another blueprint here. So if we go to blueprint class, and this time just an actor, and we're going to call this BP shop, and this is going to be and this is going to be where we're going to put our information to open and close the shop whenever we get into a particular position. So the first thing I want is just a static mesh to identify where the player needs to go in order to activate the shop. So we've created a static mesh by clicking add, go to static mesh here, and just find just a basic cube or something appropriate. There's some interesting things here. Try control rig polygon. Oh, that looks all right. Change the world grid material. Let's make it again a nice green. See what that looks like. That's very green. Maybe something a little bit nicer. Right, the blue. Not really much better than the green, but we'll leave that. So this is the area of the shop. It reflects the light. I see what's going on there. So if we add another component, this time we need a, keep scrolling down, we need a collision. I think this time it'll probably be best to use a sphere collision. So it'll cover most of these points, bearing in mind the shape that we're actually using. So I can probably make this a little bit bigger. Let's just see what 1.5 looks like. And that looks about right once the player moves into that position. That does look like it's covering it pretty well. So we have that in place now, and what we want to do is just do a quick event actor begin overlap, and it's already there for us, but it's got this little comment on, so we don't want that. So if we just type in begin overlap, and again we want the other actor to be the player, so we need to make sure it only happens when the player goes over that space. I mean, it may actually just work only in that instance anyway. So what we can do is just very quick debug check and just connect it up to a print string with hello. If we drag BP shop out into the space, you can see it's very small, so I think it needs to be made a little bit bigger. So we go back to our BP shop, go to our blueprint, default scene route, and let's change the whole thing up by 3. So everything else will scale up with it. That's a little bit better. And click play. And let's just move ourselves onto, yeah, when it goes over, it says hello. And okay, that's exactly what we wanted. So if we now go back to the shop, we then need an end overlap. Event actor end overlap. And so again, just to quickly check that that's working nicely, neatly connect that up to goodbye. Let's see. Press play. So now we should go into the space. It shouldn't work for. You see the projectile. You see it does affect it. So we do need something which only detects the player. We're going with the player, hello, and goodbye. But the projectile, and I can imagine also enemies or anything else, will also make that have the effect that we don't want it. Now, one quick trick if you're not 100% sure what, if let's say you're doing a contains from the get object name and you're not sure what the get object name immediately is, there's the hierarchy that you can look at. They're not always the same, but a nice quick trick is just get the object name, connect that into print string, and just do a quick test. So you should see projectile probably, yeah, projectile C1 and our player. So as long as it contains player, it's unlikely that it's going to be a problem. So we can get rid of both of, that one. And we'll do a contains. And substring player. Pop the branch in. And then only if that's true should it print anything. Just get rid of the double lines there, just needs to print hello. And we can check that now. If I go shoot over, nothing happens, but it does say hello when it goes over that way. And again, you can do exactly the same thing for end overlap. So we can just pop the branches in for both, just like that. So neither of these are going to be affected unless it's the player which goes in and out. Okay, and then Control Shift and S, and we can move on to the next bit. So when the player begins the overlap, that's when we actually need to open the shops. So this will be similar to when we created the HUD, and we're going to go to Create Widget. But this time we are after Shop, add to Viewport, just like that. And we can also, if I just check the cheat sheet for the collect, but we can also create the reference, yes, and we can remove it from the parent. So if we promote this to a variable, so we've got our own reference to it, just like this. Just get rid of some of the double lines. And this one, UI shop, same as the name of the widget. We can also then get a reference to this down here, and if we type remove from parent, which is the widget just there, then because we've already got a reference to it, that should delete it. So the idea is every single time that we go over that and into that space, then it opens, creates the widget, opens it up, creates a reference to it, adds that to the viewport, but then removes it at this stage whenever you move out. So now we can see if that works. So again, the app shouldn't do anything, and that's right. Go onto that space and now it works, and then we move off the space and it doesn't. So that's more or less what we wanted to happen. Go into that space, you can activate the shop, move that space, and it stops. So the next thing that we needed to do is to activate the cursor, so that when we are in that space, it actually gives us the ability to press the button, but then removes that cursor when we do the event actor end overlap. So what we need to do is just create something additional at the end after add to viewport. So now we need to get the player controller so that we can get access to the cursor. So if we type in player controller, and then we get the control value from here. If we type in cursor with context sensitive from that, and we've got set show mouse cursor, and that's the one we're after. So obviously that wants to be set to true when we're in that space, and then I can copy and paste that little bit there, and then set it to false when we move on the outside. So now if I press play, when we first start playing the game, we shoot around, no cursor, move here. We've now got our cursor, we can start pressing buttons, and then if I move outside, the cursor disappears again as soon as I start firing. So now we've done the front end, I suppose, of the shop, we can now look into the data hiding underneath. So if we go back to our content browser again, and again we're getting things a little bit messy. So I think if we first create a new folder, and we're going to start putting our blueprints in there. So the enemy can go in there, anything with a prefix of BP would make sense to pop in there. So move that into BPs, tidy things up a little bit there. Very nice. So the next thing that we need is to create a structure. So if we scroll through here, there definitely should be something here. Where am I looking? Artificial intelligence, blueprints, that's the one, blueprints and structure. With it being a structure, I use the prefix of ST, and it's going to be for an individual item. So we're going to have a series of different items, but each is going to have different bits of information in it, and here I can define what those bits of information actually are. So if we go to actually double click on that, open it up, and we will see this. We can add as many different variables as we like, so it just starts off with a simple boolean, but we can add a number of different ones. So if you remember, whilst I've still got these open, if I go to item, we've got the item name, description, and price. So if I basically duplicate that, so we've got name, and that's going to be text. And then we need description. And then we've got price. Now, price in this instance we'll just do as an integer value. So this is a really simple variation of what we're doing here. Now, with it being done in this particular way, what we can do is within this single structure apply all of the default values to each one of these individual items here, and then that would be it taken care of, at least for one particular item within this structure. But we want numerous different items to use this particular structure that they can all be then referred to in this shop. So now we've got our items in place, we can close that, and now we need a data table. So scrolling through all of these again, it's not in blueprints this time. Oh, that's disappeared. Miscellaneous and data table is what we're after, and it will ask you to pick the row structure, which is why you need to do the structure first. Then we've got st item. Okay, we'll create our new data table. If I rename that, call it dt item, so they're all connected in. Double click on that and we have something which looks like this. So this is where we can actually start populating that information based on the structure that we used. So let's just say, again, for sake of argument, we will just have 3 different things in place. I'll explain why in a moment, but I'm just going to change the row name first of all from 0, that to 0, that to 1, and that to 2. There is a method behind that madness, but we'll get to that in a little while. So now for each individual item we want to change the information. So there were 3 basic things that I wanted to do. One was have like a health potion, or a health, I need to press return or I won't save it. So health, let's just say adds 20 health, and it costs, again, pick any number you like, but we had it depends on how much money we give the player the player character at the beginning, but again, let's for sake of argument say health is 20. Press return, all those 3 are in place. Then the next one, we can call it ammo, and adds 20 projectiles, and will cost 40. And the last one, power up, and again we can be as creative as you like with this, but for sake of argument let's say increases projectile size 50%, and it costs 50. So any changes in here, obviously they are design issues, not anything else. So with that now in place, we've got our data table and we've got our structure, and now we need to find a way to get that into the items when they are created and added to the shop. So in order to do that, we actually want to delete these items. We don't need them here straight away because we're actually going to generate them at runtime when the game actually starts. So if we go into the graph and on event construct is what we'll go for. And we want to create a widget. Because obviously this is a widget going inside the widget and it's the widget item. And then we are going to parent it with that vertical box. Now the vertical box currently isn't a variable, so we need to make sure it's ticked so it becomes a variable. And the graph editor, our vertical box, is available for something that we can use, and we need to add it to a parent. So I think if we go out the parent of that, it's not remove from parent. It's not remove from parent. If we type child, add child is the one we're after. You can always use different terminology just to confuse you. So it's add child is the one that we want. So to the vertical box, which is the target, we're adding this UI item, and we're going to add it just like that. So the next thing we need to do is actually move this over to the right like so. We need something to happen before we actually create this widget, and that's to actually get the data out of that data table that we created. So if we right click and get data table row. And then what we need is actually a for loop. So type in for loop and make sure we go for this one. Now we can set this last index to be basically relevant to however many items that we've got. So again, we've got 3 items, so the integer value is always 0, 1, 2, and that brings us back to why I changed those row names to 0, 1, 2, because by changing them in that way, then when we go to this shop, we can do a for loop which just changes the integer between 0 and 2, so it goes through those 3 items, and 2 instead of 3. We change this to a string value. We can then change the string back into a name. So it gets a little bit choppy with moving things around, but it should still work. Loop the body in like that, and select the asset to be our data table. So it will basically go through each row in our data table and output a structure with the information which is in that row. And what we need to do now is actually connect that in to the widget that we created. So if I connect those up for now, compile that, and then actually go back to the UI item, because I actually want something new to happen here. So add event, custom event, and update item details. Again, as with last time, we need an input, and this time it's going to be, we'll just call it struct this time. So blueprint, this time you'll see it's not, a structure isn't available here as standard. There are structures and you could scroll through them, but the best bet is just type in st. There's lots of those, so that's not helpful. We need to go back and remember what it was called. So it was st, what was it actually called? St item is the one we're looking for. So let's go back to our shop, and st item is the structure we're after. Perfect. So now that information can be plugged into the UI shop. So once it creates that widget, that UI item, we can then have it immediately run this little bit of code, update item details. So update item details before it parents it to the vertical box. Just neaten that up a little bit. And then the out row structure goes into there. So now we're passing the information from the data table in a single structure form into the item details, and then we can extend the code here to actually have that actually change the information in place. So if we compile there, so we then need to get this information out. If you drag out from here, we can see we should actually be able to right click and split the struct pin, which could make it a little bit easier. So now we've got the struct name, struct description, and struct price. Nice and neat way of doing it. You could have also dragged out and clicked break, but now we can use this information to update the text on these particular values. So if we drag out item name, item description, and item price, we're effectively setting the text for all of these things. So once we've got one of them, 1, 2, 3. One for description, one for name, one for price. Do them in the same order that they are here. Name, description, and price. Yep, that's fine. Description into description, name into name, price converted from the integer price to the text. Again, not exactly the neatest thing in the world. There's probably a much nicer way we can do it. Actually, if we just get into a good routine from now, just keep those just neatly above, like so, and then we use the extra nodes to space these out a little bit. And those 3 can go over there. So it can feel like a little bit of extra effort at the beginning, but if you don't do this, things quickly get difficult and frustrating down the line. So it's most certainly an investment. Okay, so now the minute that information is passed through to the structure, it should update all of these pieces of information. So now if we go back to our UI shop, what we should have happen is the minute the UI shop widget is created, which happens every single time we open our shop through moving our player character into that particular space. It runs this for loop, and then for 0 to 2, it goes to the data table here that we created. It reads the information from that. It creates a widget item to put into this space here, in the order that they're created in the data table, and then it assigns the data, which should then correctly update here. So if we then compile, and this will be the big drum roll, over this way, move our player character into the space, and there's definitely some size issues, but that's because we're not playing it in a separate window, but we've got health adds 20, ammo, power up, everything in the order that we expected it to be. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is have it so that when we actually press the button within this item, it actually makes something happen. I think in this case, the best thing is to have it take the price of whatever the item is and have that affect a higher level player money value. So the first thing we need to do is actually create that. So if we go to the user interface HUD, go to the designer, you can see we've got the health variable. If we just duplicate that, and I'll move that down a little bit, we can have that more or less just underneath, and this horizontal box is now going to mean something else, but they don't need to be variables, so we can probably leave these as they are. The health prefix is now going to be money prefix. Again, that doesn't need to be a variable, and in this instance we can change whatever the set variable is here to whatever we like. Again, for sake of argument, we can just leave it as 100, but we do need to change the text value in the money prefix to money. So we now have 100 health and 100 money as is shown on that. If we go into the graph, those variables are still there. So whenever the player is hit, that's updating the health, but we also want something which is going to update the player's money. So we can create another custom event. Let's call it player spend. And everything else is going to be very similar. So it's going to be an integer change again. So inputs, this parameter is going to be money. That's going to go into there, and that's going to go into there. But then in this case, health variable needs changing. So that health variable is still called health variable. That's no good. We need money variable. So now money variable can be dragged in. And now whenever the play spend custom event is triggered, it's going to update it in this widget. So the next thing that we need to do is actually have a money variable, just like we do have a health variable, and the most sensible place to put that is in our player. So we've got our player health, so we can create our player money. And that can be a variable which we have in the scene. If we go over to wherever the event hit the player health is, we can maybe create a new one. We should definitely need to do some tidying because a lot more little functions are being added. But for sake of argument, we'll just pop it above here for the time being. So in order to get things into the right way of thinking about it, we can go back over to not the shop, but the item. And now it's whenever the button is pressed. So I don't like button 607, so I think we can change the name of that. So it's just button of the item, the shop item. There's some few things in the style that may be worth changing around. You'll notice when we actually played this, the look of it wasn't exactly brilliant. It's grey and miserable. You can clearly see when you're hovering over something, and you can clearly see when you're pressing it. But other than that, it's functional. But there's not a lot of clarity when you're hovering over because of the color of the text and so on. So that may be worth changing. And this also brings up something which may be worth the talking about. This doesn't happen every single time with the code in the state that it's in, but you've noticed this blueprint runtime error which is turned up. If this happens, you can kind of scroll to the right and navigate to exactly where it is. So we've got this show mouse cursor is the issue, and it's in the BP of shop. If I double click on it, it should take us straight to it. I can then close that off. So this is a thing which is causing trouble. Now, what I think is actually happening here is it's trying to get the mouse cursor variable at this particular point of overlapping it, and it's just not something which is valid. Now, it's an easy way to change this. We can just do return value and type is valid. It's the one with the question mark that you want, so it will check whether at that exact point the player controller is actually a valid item to be changing. If it is, then it will have the show mouse cursor effect done, and if it doesn't, then it won't. So now if we press play, and we should be able to go in and out, move around, turn it on, turn it off, escape, and we've not got that error message anymore. So hopefully that will be the last that we see of that. Right, that was a quick distraction. We can get on to what we were trying to do. So going back to our UI item. So back in our UI item, what we need to do first of all is actually save some of these variables which are being output, rather than just simply updating the text through them. So the price is the thing that we're trying to have affected. We will need to add more to this later, but for the sake of argument now, we just create that as its own variable to keep things nice and neat. And this is going to be price, which we've already got as a text item, so it needs to have a different name. So we'll just call it price value for sake of argument. So now if we have button item selected and we go for on clicked, we need to basically send the price value over to the BP player character so that it can update both its own variable and the HUD, because the HUD is already connected to the player character, so it's the most sensible way to do it. So if we right click and go for get player character, and then we're going to cast to our player, I think is what we called our player character, connect that up, and then we need a new variable. If I go to player character, we don't have the variable that we need, and we need a new event for something actually happening with money. So we'll go for update money. And if we put an input here and price there, we can add that as an integer of price. If I now go back to BP item, I think for now we can get rid of a couple of these, get rid of BP item and BP shop. We can always open them up a little bit later if we need them. So compile that again, and update money was what we called it. I'll call that function. There's price. We have price value that we can just set into that. So when it clicks the button, it will get whatever the structure price was associated with it when it created this widget, and it will now send that to our player. So we now have that information here and ready to go. We've already got player money, so that can be set to a default value of, let's say, 100. And then we can take that, subtract it by whatever the price of the item was that we have just bought. Then we can set that player money as the difference between the two. So that's updated that, and then we need to update the HUD. So if we go for the reference to UI HUD, because we've already got it, so it makes it nice and neat. If I go to the UI HUD, player spend is what we were after, and there's money. So if we go back to BPR player, and player spend, there it is. One goes into two, nice and neat. I can go up that way, so it's keeping the code pretty minimal. It's a relatively nice way of doing things. I need that just a little bit. I am gonna just as good practice. I'm not being very good at keeping up to date with these, but let's make a little bit of effort. Update money for that one, and now we have that in place. So what should now happen is we click on the item. Clicking on that casts to the player character and passes the price value, which is associated with that button, to the player character, who then subtracts it from the final player, from the their total player money, and then sends that value to the HUD, which should update it. So this is where we cross our fingers and see how well we did. Control Shift and S. So the money is set to 100. Go into the shop. This should go down by 20 if I click on it. It didn't work the first time. The first click isn't registered because of the mouse functionality, so that needs a little bit of neatening, but it went down by 20, so now it should go from 80 to 40. Yep, and because we haven't got a clamp, it will go to -10. So just quickly going back to that issue just to show you again, if we move on to the shop, opens up the shop as we need it to, we click on it first and it fires a projectile, but which we don't want it to do, and it doesn't affect the stats, which we do want it to do. It's only on the second press, and that's because of an issue with focusing on this widget. So if we close this off, what we need to get is a set input, and you've got these different options here between moving between just the game mode only, the UI mode only, and the game and UI. Now we definitely need game and UI, because what we don't want to do is to completely freeze out the other actions, because the player needs to be able to move out of the space in order to close the UI. So we need game and UI. So the first thing we need to do after we've got that is cast to the player controller. So we just need to get player controller. I'll go into there. And then the widget in focus is actually this current widget, so we can just get a reference to self. So just type in self, and that goes there. We don't want to hide the cursor, we don't want to flush the input, so we now compile that. And what should happen is we're firing away happily, move into the space, press 20, and it should immediately take 20 off, and it does. So that's much nicer and neater.